Okay, let's do this. Good morning. So today is June 6th, which means that today is it's D-Day, or at least, the anniversary of D-Day. So I do want to talk about that a little bit. Now, whenever you're going to talk about something as momentous and monumental as D-Day, there's only so much you can say about it because it's just so gigantic in scope. Um, but I do want to talk a little bit about it. Clearly, I can only give even the briefest overview of exactly what happened on D-Day, but we will talk about it a little bit since today is June 6th. So, of course, D-Day was June 6th, 1944. It it maybe sometimes gets mistaken as if people aren't necessarily thinking about the timeline of World War II, they may kind of naturally assume that it was closer to the end of the war. Um, but in reality, it was a more than a year before the war would end in Europe, but could be considered to be the beginning of the end. Now, yes, D-Day is one of the more significant days in American military history. Um, True, very true. It's also one of those days that is remembered as a key day in which the good guys began to turn the tide in World War II. Now, you all know that I question a lot of historical narratives, and World War II is no exception. Um, we could go back and we could talk here about how all wars are bankers' wars or whatever. That's not necessarily my intent today, though. So, while I do believe that most historical narratives are either outright lies in the worst case, or in the best case, intentionally incomplete. I don't necessarily want to go into that today, and here's why. So, regardless of the machinations that cause war to occur, or cause the butchery within those wars, for the most part, those who are involved in the wars are not necessarily responsible for the policies that put them in harm's way. I mean, maybe at the very, very, very top to some degree, maybe they could be, but 99+% of those who are involved in these wars, to include all the non-combatants that just find themselves embroiled in these conflicts, they don't necessarily have anything to do with having caused it or having produced the policies that result in all this death. So I do believe that it is possible and perhaps even necessary that we understand that we can have respect for and we can honor the sacrifices of individuals who have participated in these I mean unimaginable events of unimaginable destruction, and at the same time condemn in the harshest way the policies that have resulted in these things. Now, I know people out there are gonna, oh my gosh, World War II, like, what are you talking about? Blah, blah, blah. Again, not necessarily my intent today. I know there are a lot of people out there that have become almost apologists for Hitler recently. I'm not one of those guys. I also tend to draw a distinction between the Nazis and the Germans, for example. And I'll just say two things on that very briefly, and then we'll kind of get into what I actually want to discover today. So, this is just kind of broad context so people understand the way in which I approach World War II. So, I tend to think that the Nazis are kind of worse than we often look at them in history, but that the Germans aren't nearly as bad as we tend to look at them through that same period in history. So, it is important to kind of draw that distinction. And again, that's probably all I'm going to say there. I mean, I think that the Nazis were involved in some really bad stuff. I'm not a Hitler apologist. That said, yeah, I mean, I also think that anyway, whatever. I'm not going to get into that today. Let's talk about D-Day and what it means for us as Americans, because regardless of World War II, how all that happened, at the end of the day, there was a ton of destruction. A lot of people lost their lives. A lot of people came back and they were never the same, whether it was physically or whether it was psychologically, and that's certainly a shame. And of course, World War II, the way it would end would then set up the construct that would become known as the Cold War and would largely determine the second half of the geopolitical scene for or the geopolitical scene within the second half of the 20th century. So, okay, here's what I want to do. So I want to start by introducing you to a piece that I put on my Substack. I'm just going to read a part of it. So I actually put this out 2 years ago, and I called it D-Day, World War II, and Truth. Now, in this piece, I do reflect on the historical narrative and critiquing it more than I'm going to do today. So I would encourage you to go read this piece because you might be interested in what I say about that. That's just not going to be my focus for today. So I'm going to read the first portion of this, and then if you want to read the rest of it, then I'll put the link in the description. Well, like I said, I wrote this piece 2 years ago, came out on June 6th, 2023, and I entitled it D-Day, World War II, and Truth. And I put a subtitle here, Reflections on Our Past. Okay, so D-Day. June 6th is commemorated each year to mark the anniversary of D-Day, the 1944 Allied invasion across the English Channel into Normandy during World War II. By the way, and I'm going to stop right there. So I got one sentence in before I stopped. If you don't know your geography, and I know a lot of people don't, and I'm not, well, I am kind of critiquing you, but that's okay. If you don't know where like Britain is or where England is in relation in geographic relation to France, you may have in your mind, because I know a lot of people think like this, you may have in your mind that the D-Day invasion across the English Channel would have basically gone from west to east. So they would have been kind of like leaving the southwestern shore or whatever, and then traveling across the English Channel to France, traveling in an eastern direction. That is not the direction they traveled in. So Britain is north of this portion of France, and so when they were crossing the English Channel, they were actually traveling south, pretty much in a due south direction. So the reason I say that is because I know, just because I've heard people talk about this, not historians or people who have studied this, but just people who maybe just in their mind have a picture of this that isn't accurate. So in your mind, when you're picturing the crossing, the landing craft would have been moving in a southern direction. Okay, great. Though Operation Overlord, as the Channel crossing and subsequent penetration into German-occupied France became known, occurred nearly a year before Victory in Europe Day, it brought about the beginning of the end for Germany. When it comes to D-Day, there is certainly a lot to commemorate. In recognizing the date, we are not just calling attention to the bravery and sacrifice of the men who participated in the operation or in the strategic effects it produced, but also celebrating everything that had to occur just to bring it to fruition at all. While remembering those who perished is paramount in importance, it is also awe-inspiring to reflect on Operation Overlord's sheer scale. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about that, but let's keep going. Operation Overlord. Sorry, I just said we're going to keep going, but I'm going to stop right here. So let's differentiate some names very quickly. Okay, so D-Day. D-Day refers to June 6th because that is the day in which the operation kicked off. So D-Day, this is just a military terminology that just means the day that an operation is going to kick off. The hour that it's going to kick off is referred to as H hour. So D-Day is a generic term used for many operations. That term is not necessarily tied specifically to June 6th, 1944, in this specific operation. It's just that because of the sheer scale of this operation, just over time, it has become linked to this. So when people say D-Day, they think about the D-Day for Operation Overlord. But that name is more general in its scope. Okay. Overlord. So Overlord is the name of the operation, but it's more than just what happened on June 6th. So it is the entire operation that would begin on D-Day, would begin with, of course, some airborne operations. Then, of course, the cross-channel attack, the landing craft, the invasion via the beach, etc. Um, a huge deception arm as well, which we'll talk about in just a moment. So it begins with all that glider landings, etc. But then is going to go on for a couple of months, and because the objective is to liberate Western Europe. At this time, of course, France, and not just France, but much of Western Europe has been occupied by Germany, France, the Low Countries, etc. So the objective of the operation is to liberate these areas of Western Europe. And Paris would be liberated at the end of August. So that's kind of considered to be when Operation Overlord ends. So it goes from June 6th through the end of August. So we could say about 2.5 months. So it's a pretty significant operation that is much larger than just what happens on the 6th of June. It's and of course it's massive in scale. Now, some people may have heard the term Neptune. So what is Operation Neptune? So Neptune is a part of Overlord, and Neptune just refers to kind of the cross-channel portion of the operation. So it's the way in which the Normandy invasion is going to occur. But of course, there were airborne operations that were happening at the same time, etc. So Overlord, the entire operation. Neptune is kind of the initial part of Operation Overlord. Okay, let's go back to my piece. Operation Overlord. It is a fantastic operation for historians or military planners to research. As a student in the U.S. Army School of Advanced Military Studies, we studied some of the planning process that yielded Overlord. I had an instructor at SAMS. SAMS is just the School of Advanced Military Studies, who referred to it as the most complex operation ever conceived. And I mean, that he would not be unique in stating that. Plenty of historians have said the same thing. In this opinion, he agreed with Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin, who shared similar views on its vast scope. As Stephen Ambrose describes in his book D-Day, so that's this book here. Some of you guys are probably familiar with this guy, Stephen Ambrose, if you're familiar with, Band of Brothers, etc. Okay, as Stephen Ambrose describes in his book D-Day, Overlord consisted of the following, and I'm quoting Ambrose here. In one night and day, 175,000 fighting men, including 50,000 vehicles, were transported across 60 to 100 miles of open water. They were either carried by or supported by 5,333 ships and craft, and almost 11,000 airplanes. Okay, so 175,000 fighting men, 50,000 vehicles. They're transported across 60 to 100 miles of open water, and you have 5,333 ships and craft and 11,000 airplanes. I mean, just the magnitude is incredible. Ambrose goes on. He uses a Midwest geographical analogy. So he's going to help drive this point home by stating the following. It was as if the cities of Green Bay, Racine, and Kenosha, Wisconsin were picked up and moved. Every man, woman, and child, every automobile and truck to the east side of Lake Michigan in one night. So take those three cities, everything in those cities, and pick them up and move them. That's basically what happened with D-Day. So I mean, it's an interesting analogy. So the same SAMS instructor who had said that this was the most complex operation ever conceived, the same SAMS instructor also mentioned that the study of Overlord as an operation is perhaps only eclipsed by Gettysburg. That's probably true. I mean, just think about it. Even people who aren't in the military, like, oh, name a military operation that you know. Yeah, they might mention Overlord, or they'll at least say D-Day. They know about Gettysburg, of course. The D-Day invasion is the single most recognized endeavor within World War II, itself often viewed as the supreme struggle between good and evil. Now, again, we can quibble with that maybe a little bit or whatever. I'm certainly not here to say the Nazis were the good guys, but anyway, not my point today. But I do go into that a little bit in this specific piece a little bit later on beyond the point that we're going to read today. D-Day, therefore, at least for the Western Allies, has become emblematic of the entire war. In the US, the telling of the D-Day story has assumed mythic grandeur, not necessarily because of any lack of truth in the narrative, but because of its significance as part of the American tale. After all, America sees itself as a war. America sees itself as a war nation, born of war, forged in war, and refined in war. As with any mythic tale, there must be heroes. The brave souls that fought in World War II and their contemporaries became known collectively as the greatest generation. Rugged individuals steeled through the hardships of growing up during the Great Depression, to then be thrust into the furnace of war against what many have come to regard as truly evil, dark forces, which I mean, I do think the Nazis were. I just don't think, you know, I mean, I'm not a fan of Churchill or FDR, Stalin. Anyway, so I want to read here from Ambrose's book. So I'm departing now from what I was just reading in my Substack, but I just want to read a couple of things that are mentioned here in this book because it is pretty interesting. And I'm not going to read a whole lot, but I do just want to mention this. Operation Overlord, the invasion of German-occupied France in June 1944, was staggering in its scope. The effort behind this unique movement, which British Prime Minister Winston S. Churchill rightly called the most difficult and complicated operation ever to take place, stretched back 2 years in time and involved the efforts of literally millions of people. So a lot of people don't necessarily realize that when we talk about the magnitude and scope of Operation Overlord, it's not just the number of personnel. It's not just the number of craft, whether it's, watercraft or aircraft, or the strategic results that are achieved. It's also just the planning effort that went into this and the duration over time over which it had been planned. Okay, let's see. But for all that American industrial brawn and organizational ability could do, for all that the British and Canadians and other allies could contribute, for all the plans and preparations, for all the brilliance of the deception scheme, for all the inspired leadership, in the end, success or failure in Operation Overlord came down to a relatively small number of junior officers, non-coms, that means like non-commissioned officers, it means basically sergeants, and privates or seamen in the American, British, and Canadian armies, navies, air forces, and coast guards. Yeah, very true. It all came down to a bunch of 18 to 20-year-olds. They were magnificently trained and equipped and supported, but only a few of them had ever been in combat. Only a few had ever killed or seen a buddy killed. Many had never heard a shot fired in anger. They were citizen soldiers, not professionals, because a lot of the guys that participated in this did not necessarily have a lot of World War II fighting under their belt yet. Some did, but certainly not all. They were the men of D-Day, and to them we owe our freedom. Okay, and a lot of people would agree with that. Maybe we would quibble with that a little bit, but it's a monumental statement that many people certainly would buy. So, what has happened kind of leading up to June of 1944? Obviously, the war has been going on for a couple of years at this point, and lots of casualties all around. Let's talk about the French for a moment. So the French get a bad rap largely because I would say the French reputation that persists to this day, their fighting reputation, is a product of World War II. It is not at all a product of times or situations prior to World War II. If we think about World War I, and remember, American troops were, according to the European prevailing thought at the time, late to the party for World War I because they didn't arrive until the spring of 1917. The British and the French had already been um, fighting for quite a while when the Americans showed up. The Russians, and in fact the Russians would largely find themselves out of the war in 1917. And the Americans are entering the war. But here's what you may not necessarily realize. So in this time period, World War one of the reasons that it was so bloody is because there was this idea that has come to be known as the cult of the offensive. And the French were very much believers in that too. So the cult of the offensive was this idea that, the initiative rests with the attacker. Now that is true. And that therefore the strongest form of fighting is to be on the attack, to be assaulting forward. Why? Because then you choose where and when the fight takes place. Now, again, that is true. However, many people would argue, and lots of history would also show that positionally, the defense is a stronger form of fighting. Okay, because if you have defensive fortifications or some sort of network of defensive architecture that you have built up, whether it's obstacles, whether it's fortifications that have been built of some type, and then they're covered by your artillery or whatever, then it is going to take a much larger force that would assault your defensive network in order to overcome you, whether that means defeat your force or seize your terrain. So one of the reasons that some historians would look back on World War One and they would say, well, it was so bloody because both sides were kind of there was this idea of the cult of the offensive at the time. So, but my point here is that the French were very much believers in that. And when Blackjack Pershing showed up with the American Expeditionary Forces in 1917, the British and the French didn't necessarily think that the Americans were put out to fight because they had several years of hard fighting experience under their belt. The American troops show up and are green, and the American troops were actually fighting under the overall leadership of a French general at the time, Ferdinand Foch. I mean, they were led by Blackjack Pershing and all these other American commanders, but overall, there was this French commander that was leading the Allied effort. Okay, so my point just in sharing that is when you think about the way in which the French were fighting in World War One, and then you think about what happened in World War Two, there's a disconnect there. It's like, hey, what's going on? Because the French were overrun in 1940 almost immediately. And from that point forward, France was occupied. So fast forward a couple of years, and that's why the Allies decide, listen, we got to liberate Western Europe. So what's happening in France during these years? And I'm not gonna go into this because it's its own topic, but I think a lot of Americans are not even aware of this. So if you don't know what this is, I would encourage you to look this up. Look up what's going on in France during World War II. Look up this idea of what's called the Free French and then Vichy France, because France has an internal struggle that is going on because so much of France has decided to collaborate with the Germans, with the Nazis. But at the same time, others have not. And there's this like internal struggle that's going on in France to include in their government. So anyway, look up Vichy France, but also there is a massive underground resistance movement going on in France and other places too, not just France. There were other countries that had resistance forces as well. And this is important because there were messages that were being broadcast from the BBC into other parts of Western Europe. And they would include coded messages to the underground resistance fighters. Now, underground resistance fighters are just, civilians, just non-combatants. So if we're talking about France, these would be French citizens that would engage in acts like sabotage to disrupt German communication lines or bridges or whatever. So they're doing this in order to disrupt German activities. Okay, so In preparations up to D-Day, there were coded messages that were sent out by the BBC to let underground resistance fighters know in France and other locations, hey, a massive Allied invasion is about to happen. At the same time, the Germans were actually listening to those messages. We'll talk about that in just a moment. We'll come back to that. Had there been amphibious landings earlier in the war? Yes. So you got to remember, World War II is massive in its sheer size. And so if we think about it in terms of theaters of war, we're talking about what's going to happen in Western Europe, but there are other theaters. So there's the Mediterranean, there's everything that's going on in Italy, Sicily, etc. Right? So that's the theater of war. There's also the Southwest Pacific under the command of General MacArthur. There's the Pacific Ocean area under the command of Admiral Nimitz. So these are other theaters of war. And in fact, there's even this coordination relationship with what's going on with the Chinese at the same time. Why? Because while World War II is going on, there's this Sino-Japanese struggle that's, there have been various Sino-Japanese wars throughout the first half of the 20th century. So the Chinese and the Japanese are fighting. Well, if the Chinese are fighting the Japanese, that some would say that kind of makes them our ally. In fact, I have a book right over here called Forgotten Ally, and it kind of talks about what's happening with the Chinese at this same time period. And under Chiang Kai-shek. Anyway, that's a whole other story, because then you're going to get into the Chinese Civil War, and you've got the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek, and you've got the communists under Mao Zedong. And then what happens? The communists kind of run the nationalists off. They end up on the island of Formosa, which we now call Taiwan, and that's how we get that whole that entire episode in history. So all of this is happening in these other theaters of war that are separate and distinct from Western Europe. Just as an example, think about all the fighting that had gone on in North Africa. With whom? Rommel, the Desert Fox. Well, where is Rommel now in June of 1944? He's in Western Europe. So you may remember him if you know anything about his Africa Corps. A very, very able commander for the Germans. But he is now in Western Europe. And he is in charge of setting up a lot of the fortifications, because the Germans know a cross-channel attack is coming. But they don't know when, and they don't know where. So I mentioned that there were these actually let me not go into these coded messages just yet. I know I already mentioned it, but let me mention something else, because I'm kind of diverting from my timeline here. And I apologize. You gotta listen to me ramble on. So I mentioned that there had been other amphibious landings. There also had been in 1942 this raid. It's called the Dieppe raid, and it was considered to be a failure. So it was a brave assault conducted largely by Canadians, resulted in a lot of casualties. Now, when we talk about this raid in size, it was nothing. It was a couple thousand, 5,000 or 6,000, mostly Canadian troops. Very brave, very daring, but it was certainly extremely small when we look at what D-Day would end up being. It's largely considered to be a failure because the Canadians took a ton of casualties. However, it provided some lessons learned that would then be applied for D-Day. But that happened in August of 1942. So in 1943, there were already ideas that, hey, there's going to have to be a massive cross-channel attack to invade and liberate Western Europe. This is what's just going to have to happen to push the Germans out of Western Europe. So how is that going to happen? So there was this planning cell that was created, and it was called COSSAC, C-O-S-S-A-C. Well, what does that stand for? Well, it stands for Chief of Staff to the Supreme Allied Commander. So I got a book right here. You can see that the title of the book is COSSAC. And it it's a planning cell. So Cossack is a planning cell that was set up before you ever actually had a theater headquarters. So it was set up under a British general, Lieutenant General Frederick Morgan, Sir Frederick Morgan. All right, so I'm going to read a little bit about this because a lot of people don't know about this. So, um, I mean, this thing was planned for this thing was conceptualized for 2 years and planned over a year, and there was planning. So, what would eventually become Operation Overlord was planned before there was really a theater headquarters, and before there was a Supreme Allied commander that, of course, would end up being General Eisenhower. But before he was even named as the commander, they were already starting to plan the operation that would become Overlord. So they grabbed this guy, Lieutenant General Sir Frederick Morgan, and they said, hey, you got to start at least putting together the initial framework of what's going to be the plan for a cross-channel attack. Sorry, we don't know who your boss is going to be yet. Meaning we don't know who the commander is going to be. So we just need you to start planning this operation. All right. So I'm going to read from a little bit here in this book. So it's just simply called Cossack, Lieutenant General Sir Frederick Morgan, and the Genesis of Operation Overlord, Stephen Kepper. So I'm reading here just from the preface because it's pretty interesting. A lot of people have never even heard of Cossack. And you can't understand the Operation Overlord story if you don't appreciate where it came from and the role of Cossack. Okay, Overlord D-Day has become the D-Day of World War II, recounted, celebrated, analyzed in countless books, articles, films. Quite understandably, most of the interesting focuses of the story of the battle, Omaha Beach, Pegasus Bridge, the Bocage, St. Mary-Glise, Falaise, Operation Cobra, and the liberation of Paris. There is, I submit, another story of great interest, that of the process by which it became possible for the cross-channel assault to occur. That is, a detailed examination of the arguments, decisions, and context in which they were made that led to a successful re-entry into the continent by a coalition force. Relatively few know the story of an ad hoc Allied staff that came to be named Cossack and how the outline plan came to be. While changes were made before it became the Neptune/Overlord plan of June 6, 1944, it was the plan on which all the political and strategic decisions were based. Its history is essential to a complete appreciation of Overlord. As a result of a decision made by the combined chiefs of staff at the Casablanca Conference in January 1943, let me stop right there. Okay, combined chiefs of staff. All right. You've got your theaters of war. Okay, I mentioned a couple of them. You got the Mediterranean, you got the Southwest Pacific, the Pacific Oceans area. Okay, now you're about ready to have Western Europe. There are commanders in charge of each of those theaters. So Eisenhower will be the Supreme Allied commander, but for that theater, for the Western European theater of war. Okay, not for the entirety of Allied operations in World War II, just the Western European theater. If you're a theater commander, so if you're Eisenhower, if you're Nimitz, if you're MacArthur, who do you answer to? Who is your boss? The combined chiefs of staff. Okay, what are the combined chiefs of staff? Well, it's kind of exactly what it sounds like. So it's this body or committee made of the British and American chiefs of staff. So on the U.S. side, it was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and then the Joint Chiefs of Staff for the various services. Okay. But they together in determining strategic direction for Allied operations in the war, they had this kind of, combined body. So this British American combined. Anyway, yeah, they called themselves the Combined Chiefs of Staff. Now they in turn would answer to Roosevelt and Churchill. All right. As a result of a decision made by the combined chiefs of staff at the Casablanca Conference in January 1943, 49-year-old British Lieutenant General Sir Frederick Morgan, a field artillery officer with 20 years of service with the Indian Army and who had led elements of the 1st Armored Division in France in 1940, was tasked with examining and evaluating the various studies and proposals that had been written over the prior 2 years and turning them into something that resembled an outline for a possible assault or series of assaults to create a lodgment somewhere in France. The goal was to achieve some understanding of what it might take to re-enter the continent by force. Against determined opposition was one term used. So against determined opposition, meaning the Germans. There were many in positions of authority who were not convinced it could be accomplished at all. The examination was necessary because since the British had been beaten off the continent, an amphibious assault was the only way back. All right, I'm skipping a little bit here. Should the Allies cross the Channel as soon as forces could be gathered for the assault, or should they wait for the Germans to be worn down and weakened in secondary theaters of operation, thus making success more likely but taking more time? If it were to be an assault across the Channel, there was no agreement as to where the landing should occur, nor was there a commander-in-chief, meaning there was no Eisenhower yet. Just Morgan, a temporary 3-star general designated as chief of staff who did not have command authority and was not given much guidance from the British chiefs of staff one way or the other. Morgan, so, when they say chief of staff, like, hey, chief of staff, but chief of staff to whom? Like the staff for whom? For what commander? Morgan changed the terms and scope of his assignment, envisioning a design of an approach to a staff that had not been attempted before. He created the embryo of what would be the commander's operational staff, resolved arguments, made decisions, created policies, and expanded the work of his staff into areas not previously considered by the combined chiefs. There was no template for his concept of a multinational staff that would plan a campaign and then become the core of the operational headquarters for a coalition army, as well as naval forces and tactical air forces executing that key campaign. Morgan had to invent that as well. He also came up with a name for himself and his staff, Cossack, Chief of Staff, Supreme Allied Commander. Along the way, he had an hour-long one-on-one meeting with President Franklin Roosevelt. Now, remember, he's a British general. An extraordinary occurrence for a relatively junior officer of an allied nation. He spent more than a month in Washington, D.C. at the invitation of and as guest of General George Marshall, the U.S. Army's Chief of Staff. All right, so I'm just skipping a little bit here. Cossack, in the short 9 months of its existence, created the outline plan that made it possible for the Allied Combined Chiefs of Staff to have discussion at a very practical level, to understand in concrete terms what was meant by choosing either an early cross-channel assault and drive toward the heart of Germany, or using the Mediterranean as a means of exhausting the Germans, hoping that bombing German cities combined with Russian successes would fatally weaken Adolf Hitler's forces. All right. Morgan did not create the Overlord outline plan on his own, nor was he the innovator behind the solution to every problem. Not every problem was solved before Dwight Eisenhower was assigned as the Supreme Allied Commander in early December 1943. Okay, so he becomes the commander about 6 months before the operation is going to happen. No one in Morgan's position could have accomplished that, and certainly not with the resources he was told to use in creating the plan or with the deadlines he was given. He had to be both manager and leader, ambassador and advocate. He was speaking on behalf of and guarding the prerogatives of a commander whose name no one knew, meaning before Eisenhower had been named, and then certainly before, being put in position. He had to learn to not be bothered by the fact that he was the chief of staff to an unnamed commander, writing a plan and taking essential steps to ensure its success, even though it might never happen. At the end of the process, it finally got a commander, having been built more from the bottom up than one would usually find to be the case. One would expect that a commander would be assigned the mission. He or she would then recruit staff or use existing staff to plan and then conduct the operation. Cossack developed the other way around. Morgan started with an empty office, recruited staff, formulated a plan, and then at the last minute received the commander. Morgan had the support of Major General Ray Barker from the U.S. Army, who is his deputy. So Morgan is a British 3-star general. He's Cossack. Deputy Cossack is an American 2-star general. Because remember, this is a combined staff, so it's British and American. The two, who met for the first time in the spring of 1943, worked together as if they had known each other for years. This was at a time when coalition staffs were rare at best. They made it up as they went along. The success that they achieved together in a short period of time was remarkable. The story is fundamentally about the individuals who worked 18 to 20 hours a day, 6.5 days a week for months on end to make it possible. It is a story that has its beginnings at the Casablanca Conference in January of 1943 and that ends with the arrival of Eisenhower and Montgomery in January of 1944. So Bernard Montgomery of the British Army will actually serve as the ground for what today we would call the ground forces commander. So he would be in charge of all the actual ground operations that would happen as a part of Operation Overlord. So let me go back and see if there's anything that I wanted to finish up reading from my piece here. So I put a little bit in here about Cossack, but I just read some from the book. Okay, so I think that I'm going to read another paragraph or two, and then we'll move on. D-Day's impact. As an American, I'm inspired by the stories of bravery that occurred on that fateful day. As a former military officer and commander, I can't help but think about the command and control challenges inherent in leading such a complex operation amid such massive chaos. As a former SAM student, I'm also impressed by the massive effort that would have been needed to even produce a workable plan. The SAMS instructor that I mentioned before was a great fan of the work performed by Cossack and had studied their staff extensively. He admired their analysis of the problem they faced and the balance they achieved in planning amid the information they knew and what they didn't know. He even once told us that some of the products from Cossack were the finest military staff work he had ever seen. At some point, he even used the word brilliant to describe one of their staff products. He had never used the word brilliant to describe any coursework we produced. It is sobering to think of those who had to endure the hell of D-Day. It's also mind-boggling to reflect on the millions and millions of man-hours of planning and preparation conducted for the operation to occur. Okay, so if you want to read I'll put the link to that down below, and if you want to read the rest of that piece, we actually do go through kind of questioning some of the historical narratives, talking a little bit about what happens after World War II, the way it kind of sets up the Cold War, some of the things that happen, on our side, some of what our own government is involved in at the close of the war. Then you can read through that piece. Okay, so let me show you guys something, because I do find this interesting, and you might find this interesting as well. So let's talk a little bit more about Cossack for a moment. And I'm going to show you guys two forms of a document. So it's a Cossack document. All right, let me just pull it up here. Okay. So this is a Cossack staff document. I'm going to show you two versions of this because this one's interesting. I mean, it has a lot of notes on it, and then I'll show you like a cleaner version. So this is one that I got when I was a student at Sam's. Anyway, it's got some stuff, scratched out. It's got some handwritten notes on here. It is a little hard to read in certain areas, but it's at least kind of cool because um you can actually see further down in the document, you can see where some notes have, some pretty extensive notes have been written. And you can even see where there's almost like some back of the napkin math that is starting to take place. Yeah, see this here? Yeah, so starting to think up like, okay, British divisions, US divisions right here, airborne divisions. What are we looking at? So it's pretty interesting. So this is a Cossack staff document, um, but kind of hard to read in some areas. So yeah, planned diversions of cargo ships direct to French ports. So um, yeah, that's kind of interesting. But I'm going to show you another version of it too, and this is from. So this is a cleaner. Um, this is from a book um, that I'll show you. Just pulling it up. Okay, so here's a book. You can find it online. I'll show you guys I'll give you the link to it. So, and this is just from the U.S. Army's Center of Military History. So you can find this online. I mean, they've got it posted on their website. So, which is the website of the Army's Center of Military History. So anyway, so you can see, so this book, it's by Gordon Harrison, and it's called Cross Channel Attack. So then I just wanted you guys to see the book. Like I said, if you want to check it out, you can find the whole book online, and it's got a lot of interesting material in it. But what I want to show you is a specific portion that is um, one of the appendices of the book, which is just another version of that digest, because then you can find it in that book. Okay. So this is Appendix A at the back of that book that I just showed you, Cross Channel Attack. And this is the same Cossack digest document. So it's a digest of Operation Overlord. And you can go through and you can read it. It's only a couple of pages. But I'll tell you guys, because this is kind of interesting. So the part that my instructor said was like kind of brilliant analysis is some of the paragraphs in here. So for example, I'm going to read this paragraph 14. So again, this is a document from this planning cell Cossack, kind of a digest of what the operational plan is supposed to be. So we'll read here. As it is impossible to forecast with any accuracy the number and location of German formations in reserve in 1944, while on the other hand, the forces available to us have been laid down, an attempt has been made in this paper to determine the wisest employment of our own forces and then to determine the maximum number of German formations which they can reasonably overcome. Apart from the air situation, which is an overriding factor, the practicability of this plan will depend principally on the number, effectiveness, and availability of German divisions present in France and the Low Countries in relation to our own capabilities. This consideration is discussed below. Now, I am going to move a little bit further down to another paragraph and read something similar. The next condition is that the number of German offensive divisions in reserve must not exceed a certain figure on the target date if the operation is to have a reasonable chance of success. The German reserves in France and the Low Countries as a whole, excluding divisions holding the coast, German Armed Forces divisions and training divisions, should not exceed on the day of the assault 12 full-strength first quality divisions. In addition, the Germans should not be able to transfer more than 15 first quality divisions from Russia during the first 2 months. Moreover, on the target date, the divisions in reserve should be so located that the number of first quality divisions which the Germans could deploy in the Caen area to support the divisions holding the coast should not exceed 3 divisions on D-Day, 5 divisions on D+2, or 9 divisions on by D+8. During the preliminary period, therefore, every effort must be made to dissipate and divert German formations, lower their fighting efficiency, and disrupt communications. Okay. By the way, D+2, what that means is D-Day plus 2 days. So 2 days after D-Day, which would be June 8th, or D+8. That's just 8 days after D-Day. Okay. So what exactly does this mean? And why is this so interesting that these planners had done? So what they had done is they had basically said, hey, we don't know the number of troops that the Germans are going to have. So how can we figure out how many troops we need or what our chances of success are? You know, that's basically the question. So what they did was they said, well, if we don't know the number of troops that the Germans are going to have, what can we do? We've got to continue planning this. So, you know, we're going to have to make some assumptions. So let's talk about what planning assumptions are. So when you're planning an operation or really anything, there's going to be uncertainty. So you're going to have facts and assumptions. Hey, we have these facts. We have these assumptions. So what are an assumption? An assumption is when you don't have the information you wish you had, but you've got to move forward in the planning. So you're just going to make an educated guess. Okay. So, all right, we've got an informed idea as to what we think it is. That's an assumption. We're clearly marking that is an assumption. It is not a fact. Through our ongoing intelligence efforts, we hope to turn that assumption into a fact or to discard it or to modify it or whatever. But for right now, we can't just stop at that piece of critical information that we don't have. We have to keep moving forward in the planning process. We mark that as an assumption. We keep moving forward. We refine as we go. So there's a lot that goes on into planning, specifically for very, very large scale operations, and certainly for something of this size, right? So there is what's called a relative combat power analysis. And a relative combat power analysis is basically when you look at, we want to understand the correlation of forces or other means, right? So what's our correlation of forces compared to the correlation of forces between us and the enemy. Well, in order to determine that correlation, you can do what's basically called a relative combat power analysis, which is exactly what it sounds like. So you're going to go through, and it's going to be a quantitative and a qualitative assessment, but you're going to go through, and the first thing you're going to look at is, well, let's just count the number of soldiers, and let's count the number and type of weapon systems or vehicles. And then you're going to go through some of the, you're going to create a more qualitative assessment because you're going to have to go through some of the intangibles. But let's just talk about the numbers for a moment. So what COSAC did in this document is they said, we don't know the number that they have. However, we know the number that we can have, and we think we know, based on a correlation of forces, kind of the ratio that we would need in order to be successful, which means there's a number of German troops that we think we can reasonably overcome. So our job has to be to ensure that they don't exceed that number. So when he goes through and he says, hey, as long as they don't have, X number of German divisions on D-Day, or Y number of German divisions on D+2, or Z number on D+8, then we should have reasonable chances of success. So they basically just kind of, flipped their equation and said, all right, because typically a relative combat power analysis would be, we know with some accuracy what the enemy has, and so we can determine the ratio between what we've got and what they've got, and come up with at least a numerical assessment of our likely outcome. Okay, then you're going to add in some of the more qualitative stuff, and sure, it's going to get slightly more abstract, but that's kind of how it's done. So here they're saying, well, we know the ratio we want to have, and we know the forces we have, but we don't know what they've got, but we can at least come up with a number, which they do. They put the number of divisions, and they say, as long as they don't exceed this on this specific day, then our chances of success are reasonable. So what are the other operations that we can do, whether it's in other theaters or whatever, to ensure that on D-Day and then subsequently they don't have the forces that would then skew the ratio into their favor? So let's talk about the ratio for a moment. So generally speaking, if you are the assaulting force and you're going to attack an enemy that is in a well-established defensive posture, then typically the ratio is set at 3-1. So what does that mean? It means that the attacking force needs to be 3 times larger than the defending force, basically just to even the odds. That 3-1 ratio now achieves parity between the two forces. So now why? Because if you're the assaulting force, you're moving into a well-established defense. It's going to be much harder for you to create casualties on the defending side than it is for them to create casualties on you as you're exposed and assaulting forward. The most extreme example of this would be guys who are on an exposed beach after coming out of the landing craft, who are either, wading through the water or are on the beach itself and are, exposed to the German soldiers that are there in fortified positions, well defended, that are, engaging. Okay. So while we're talking about kind of the math that goes with the planning, because this is kind of some interesting stuff, I do want to mention this to you guys. And maybe you think it's interesting, maybe you don't, and that's okay. But there's a guy that's kind of, he's talked about hugely in the military. Some would say too much, but guy's name is Karl von Clausewitz, right? If you've been in the military for a couple of years, you've probably studied him. And the U.S. military studies Clausewitz a lot, and some would say too much. And he is kind of a war philosopher. Now, he was a general. He was a Prussian general. This book is almost 200 years old. It is dense to read, and it was unfinished when he died. It was published by his wife. But anyway, but there's a lot of stuff that is quite interesting in here. And like I said, he was a Prussian general. He wrote a lot. He was clearly a well-educated and a smart guy. and he had a lot of these commentaries on on um, on war, and from the practical side, but almost from kind of approaching war as a phenomenon too. So plenty of people have critiqued him, but I'm going to read something here because it is interesting. So he says, now this is a guy who, when he is critiqued for a lot of times being a little bit esoteric, kind of talking and when I say esoteric, I don't mean that in some like occult way. I just mean that um in it can be a little bit opaque. It can be kind of hard to know exactly what he's saying. But anyway, so he does say here, and I'm reading from page 178. Um, in fact, the means, and you got to remember, he's writing this probably around 1830 or so, give or take. In fact, the means and forms that the strategist employs are so very simple, so familiar from constant repetition, that it seems ridiculous in the light of common sense when critics discuss them, as they do so often with ponderous solemnity. Thus, such a commonplace maneuver as turning an opponent's flank may be hailed by critics as a stroke of genius, of deepest insight, or even of all inclusive knowledge. Can anyone imagine anything more absurd? Now, let's pay attention to this next part here. It is even more ridiculous when we consider that these very critics usually exclude all moral qualities from strategic theory and only examine material factors. All right, so they exclude all moral qualities from strategic theory and only examine material factors. They reduce everything to a few mathematical formulas of equilibrium and superiority, of time and space, limited by a few angles and lines. If that were really all, it would hardly provide a scientific problem for a schoolboy. Okay, so what's he saying? All right, so there are factors, some of which are quantitative, and then some of which are not. Otherwise, you could just look at a pending battle and you could say, all right, what are the numbers you have here? What are the numbers you have there? Measure a couple angles, what today would be called battlefield geometry. And then you could just, and there were types of algorithms that were used to figure out quantitatively who would have the, the advantage on the field. There was that kind of stuff. And he's saying, hey, there is more to it than that. Now, here's a guy who critiques Clausewitz, and the reason we're talking about this, and we're not going to go too crazy in this, but Overlord is a great example to look at it because of the sheer numbers involved and because of the sheer like analytics that would have been part of the planning process, because they certainly were and they certainly would be today. So anyway, so you got the Clausewitz delusion here. This dude is Stephen Melton. I'm just going to read a little bit here. So he obviously critiques, pretty sure he's a retired colonel. But anyway, he critiques, it's been a while since I've read his book. But yeah, so he critiques Clausewitz a bit. And I'm not, again, who's right, who's wrong, not necessarily my intent. I do think there needs to be a qualitative and a quantitative approach. And I think it's interesting when we keep that in mind, when we look at something as complex as Overlord. But anyway, so Stephen Melton here is saying in the introduction to his book, because this is really interesting, he says, the Army of the 1980s replaced William Tecumseh Sherman with Karl von Clausewitz as the primary author of the Army's philosophical foundation. Now, I'm not a fan of Sherman. Anyway, but whatever. In the blink of an eye, center of gravity analysis and decisive battle replaced attrition as the basis of the Army's understanding of war. But the most disturbing quality of late 20th century Army doctrine is an intensely ahistorical and unempirical understanding of warfare. Okay. So he's saying, hey, we're looking back on Clausewitz, who, he's talking almost 200 years earlier, we're looking at this stuff and we're trying to figure out our philosophical approach to warfare. Maybe it's not the best approach. He goes on. Rather than take the rationalist engineering approach to war that characterized the U.S. Army's experience, Clausewitz explains success in battle in terms of intangibles, the genius of the leader, the role of chance, the will of the army, and its mood for battle. Reflecting these rediscovered romantic era notions, U.S. Army doctrine in the 1980s and 1990s increasingly viewed all situations as being inherently different, and it challenged commanders to come up with unique solutions for each problem they faced. In a Clausewitzian universe, each problem is unique. The problem with this approach is that it relies on finding genius in combat leaders at the expense of giving merely good commanders a way to routinely achieve 80% solutions to the problems they face, and genius is rare. Okay, so very interesting. The pragmatism and engineering approaches that characterize the Army of the Progressive Era and World War II have been abandoned. Instead, the Army now embraces the intangibles of art and intuition, all the while hoping that military leaders can somehow derive their own formulas for success. Now, I do find that very interesting. So, there is what's called military art. There is what's called military science. I would say both are important, but that's an interesting note there. So this is a really interesting book. It's a little booklet. Charles Kirkpatrick. It's called An Unknown Future and a Doubtful Present: Writing the Victory Plan of 1941. Okay, little booklet. Really interesting for anyone that's interested at all in military planning. Now, why is this interesting? So, first of all, Victory Plan of 1941. This doesn't have anything to do with D-Day. All right, I'm going to read something here because it has to do with our discussion, but it is not. It's not about D-Day. So, the Victory Plan for 1941. What they're referring to is a small group of officers, and really one main guy, who started to write what would become a mobilization plan, an initial strategy. And this was being conceived and was starting to be crafted before we ever even entered World War II. It was just, I mean, you can draw your own conclusions there, but just looking out and saying, hey, look at what's going on in Europe. So kind of this is at the tail end of what we would call the interwar period, meaning the period between World War I and World War II. And so U.S. military leaders saying, hey, if we had to mobilize, how would we do so? And how would we, project once again, if need be, into, what would be the strategy, et cetera, to do that. So I'm just reading here from the introduction to this work, because there's a really interesting paragraph that I think is interesting for what we're talking about right now, even though it is not specific to D-Day. It kind of goes back to this, like when you're performing your analytics for a massive operation that you're planning, and you're assessing your strengths relative to the enemy's, like how do you do that quantitative and qualitatively? All right. So I'm reading here from the introduction. It says, such an understanding is vital for modern planners. For World War II is the only full mobilization of the United States Army. I'm sorry. World War II is the only full mobilization the United States Army has experienced in the modern age. Quantitative issues often preoccupy modern planners who try to figure the number of divisions, types, and quantities of weapons, training, and deployment of the Army upon mobilization. Certainly, these are important matters, but the question may well be raised whether they are the only important issues to be considered. In fact, such quantitative issues are almost always variables that depend upon the social, political, military, and technological contexts of the day. Rather therefore than seeking numerical answers to constantly evolving questions, The modern planner must devise a rational approach to solving a problem that has endless and conflicting variables. All right. So, the guy who started writing this plan, he was a major at the time. His name was Wedemeyer. He'd go on to be a general, but that's kind of who that is about. All right. So, um, what else do we want to say? The reason I've kind of taken the approach that I've taken today is because some of this stuff is stuff that people may not necessarily recognize about D-Day. Um, and I just wanted to maybe give you some background that you weren't necessarily aware of, just in case you might find it interesting, or maybe there'd be something you'd want to go and look at on your own and maybe look more into something. But I will say, so this is a really cool book. Some of you guys have probably heard of it. You definitely heard the terminology. You maybe even have seen the movie. I was watching some of the movie last night. So Cornelius Ryan, this is The Longest Day. Now he wrote another book, also made into a movie called A Bridge Too Far. But anyway, really cool book. So he was a war correspondent, so he's got a little bit of a different feel in the way that he writes this book. You know, a war correspondent is not exactly a historian, you know, so they have slightly different perspectives. Very readable. So if you're looking for a book that's not that thick, um, less than 300 pages, and a pretty easy read, has a lot of good photos, then this may be the book for you if you're looking to read something. The Stephen Ambrose book is a lot larger. Also a really good read. I've read more of this one, but also a really good book and a really good reference. The movie, yeah, John Wayne movie, The Longest Day. So I think the movie came out in 1962. Pretty sure the book was written in 1959. Yeah, 1959. So you're thinking, okay, so 15 years after D-Day would have taken place. Here's what I like about this book. I'm just going to tell you guys a little bit about it, and then I'm going to read just a little bit in it. So it kind of sets the stage. And when people are writing, my perspective, when people are writing about a certain battle or an operation, um, so this guy's Irish, but if you're, let's say, um, if you're from one side or the other, and your writing may come across as biased towards one side, and that may be okay. That may be intentional. You know, that may be the reason that you're writing it. However, it will, whatever the writing is, will have much more balance if there is certain consideration that is given to the other side. If for no other reason than just to try and offer kind of a counterweight to what you're writing about. Okay, so this is what the Allies are thinking as they are planning and then rehearsing and then preparing and then executing the assault. But on the other side, what are the Germans thinking, or what have they done to prepare? So he does that. He actually does that really well, and he interviewed some of the German officers afterwards. So I really appreciate that perspective. So he says, and I'll just read what he says in the very beginning, just so you can understand the perspective that he's coming from. Again, writing this in 1959. So he says, um, Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Europe, began at precisely 15 minutes after midnight on June 6th, 1944, in the first hour of a day that would be forever known as D-Day. At that moment, a few specially chosen men of the American 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions stepped out of their planes into the moonlit night over Normandy. 5 minutes later, and 50 miles away, a small group of men from the British 6th Airborne Division plunged out of their planes. These were the Pathfinders, the men who were to light the dropping zones for the paratroopers and glider-borne infantry that were soon to follow. The Allied airborne armies clearly marked the extreme limits of the Normandy battlefield. Between them and along the French coastline lay 5 invasion beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Through the pre-dawn hours, as paratroopers fought in the dark hedgerows of Normandy, the greatest armada the world had ever known began to assemble off those beaches. Almost 5,000 ships carrying more than 200,000 soldiers, sailors, and Coast Guardsmen, beginning at 6:30 a.m. and preceded by a massive naval and air bombardment. A few thousand of these men waded ashore in the first wave of the invasion. What follows is not a military history, it is the story of people. The men of the Allied forces, the enemy they fought, and the civilians who were caught up in the bloody confusion of D-Day, the day the battle began that ended Hitler's insane gamble to dominate the world. I'm not one of these that thinks that I'm not a fan of Hitler at all. I'm not one of these Hitler apologists in any way. I don't necessarily think he was trying to dominate the whole world. But more importantly, I really like this line. It is the story of people, the men of the Allied forces, the enemy they fought, and the civilians who were caught up in the bloody confusion of D-Day. So that is the way in which he writes this book. So it is written as much as possible from the perspective of the Allied assaulters, the assaulting force, the German defenders, as much as he's able to write from their perspective, and then even somewhat from the French civilians that are almost kind of caught in the fray, right? Which some of them, of course, some of the French are going to be part of the underground resistance, and then some of them are just people living in these sleepy little French towns occupied by Germans that see a bunch of dudes, parachuting overhead, or will have soldiers coming into their towns, having invaded along the beaches, and then sweeping along. Okay. I want to read another quotation to you guys, just in case you're not aware of where this comes from. All right, listen to this. This is a quotation. The first 24 hours of the invasion will be decisive. The fate of Germany depends on the outcome. For the Allies, as well as Germany, it will be the longest day, which is, of course, where he gets his title for the book and then the movie. So who said that? Rommel. So if you're curious where the term "the longest day," which I think is a great way to kind of capture, D-Day, it comes from Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. So he said that to his aide, April 22nd, 1944. Okay. So Rommel's been moved to Western Europe. Rommel is setting up a lot of the defensive architecture. Why? Do the Germans know that a cross-channel attack is coming? Yes. They don't know when, they don't know where. And in fact, many of them think it's going to happen in a place called Pas-de-Calais, which would allow for the shortest crossing across the channel. And the Allies did a lot to reinforce in the Germans' minds the idea that the invasion would occur at Pas-de-Calais. And in fact, they actually set up an entirely fictitious unit. They used a bunch of dummy tanks. You probably even heard about this before. So they set up this fictitious unit, the First Army. And anyway, they gave it a commander and everything, and used these inflatable tanks. You guys should read about that. But there was a massive deception arm of Operation Overlord to make the Germans believe the invasion was going to happen at Pas-de-Calais. All right, there were bombing runs on Pas-de-Calais that would make the Germans think that, okay, those bombing runs are to kind of, they're a shaping effort for the actual invasion that's going to occur. All right. And of course, then it didn't. But also, Rommel did not think it was going to happen in these first couple of days of June. And in fact, he actually went on leave to go visit his wife, whose birthday was on June 6th. So he had just departed to go on leave for a couple of days. All right. So let's see. So here's what's happening. I'm going to read a couple things and then we'll close out. Okay, so there's a German intelligence officer named Meyer. All right, so he's listening to the radio, and one of the things they're listening to are these coded messages, right? So on the night of June 1st, Meyer's men, after months of monitoring, had intercepted the first part of the Allied message. It was not unlike the hundreds of other coded sentences that Meyer's men had picked up during the previous months. This is June 1st. Daily, after the regular BBC news broadcasts, coded instructions in French, Dutch, Danish, and Norwegian were read out to the underground. Most of the messages were meaningless to Meyer, and it was exasperating not to be able to decode such cryptic fragments. And some of these messages would say things like, the Trojan War will not be held. Molasses tomorrow will spurt forth cognac. John has a long mustache. So I mean, like these almost like nonsensical statements. Anyway, the message that followed the 9 p.m. BBC News on the night of June 1st was the one that Meyer understood only too well. Okay, so what happened was the BBC broadcast, then right after it, there was a pause. And then, so in French, it said the long sobs of the violins of autumn. Okay, that's what it said in French. So anyway, so Meyer's intel guys immediately are like, whoa, that's it. That's it. Okay. Why? Because they had been warned to expect a message that would be the first line of a song called The Song of Autumn by the 19th century French poet Paul Verlaine. Okay, so they had been waiting for this specific first line from this poem. It was transmitted, and they're like, this is a message. The last half of the message would be the second line of the poem. Wound my heart with a monotonous languor. So whenever that line would be broadcast, it would mean the invasion will begin within 48 hours with the start counting at midnight. Okay. All right. So they hear the first line and they're like, oh, we were told to be ready for this. So what this means is kind of like heads up. And then when you hear the second line, which could be broadcast at a later date, now you know the invasion is going to happen basically within 48 hours. Okay. So they've just gotten the first message, and they basically tell their higher headquarters, and a lot of the higher headquarters on the German side are very skeptical. Okay, so all right, where is our man Eisenhower? So Eisenhower, see what I want to read for you guys. So you probably know that D-Day was supposed to be June 5th, and then it was pushed back to June 6th. All right. So we've been setting up, we've been bringing all these men and materiel to England to set up for this cross-channel attack. Okay. So on the night of the 4th, so June 4th. All right, here we go. That's when the decision is going to be made. It's going to take place on the 6th. It had already been canceled for the 5th. So again, I'm reading from The Longest Day, and I'm reading on page 58. Throughout most of June 4th, Eisenhower remained alone in his trailer. He and his commanders had done everything to ensure that the invasion would have every possible chance of success at the lowest cost in lives. But now, after all the months of political and military planning, Operation Overlord lay at the mercy of the elements. Eisenhower was helpless. All he could do was to wait and hope that the weather would improve. But no matter what happened, he would be forced to make a momentous decision by the end of the day, June 4th. To go or to postpone the assault once again. It's already been postponed. It's already not happening on the 5th. Okay. Eisenhower was faced with a dreadful dilemma. On May 17th, he had decided that D-Day would have to be one of 3 days in June. When this thing was being planned by Cossack, like, a year earlier, The original target date was May 1st. Have everything ready for May 1st. They had since, rolled it to June. The problem is the weather would always it would only allow for an acceptable window a couple of days a month. But there are other things going on in the other theater of operations that they also kind of wanted Overlord to coincide with. The Soviets were conducting some operations, et cetera. And the Germans were also thinking in those times too. Like, all right, if a cross-channel attack comes, is it going to be basically synchronized with something that the Soviets are doing after the thaw, after the spring thaw of the ground? All right. Eisenhower was faced with a dreadful dilemma. On May 17th, he had decided that D-Day would have to be one of 3 days in June, the 5th, the 6th, or the 7th. Meteorological studies had shown that two of the vital weather requirements for the invasion could be expected for Normandy on those days: a late rising moon, and shortly after dawn, a low tide. All right, so what do we want? We want a late rising moon and a low tide. We want both of those requirements. The paratroopers and glider-borne infantry who would launch the assault, some 18,000 men of the U.S. 101st and 82nd Divisions and the British 6th Division, needed the moonlight. So you need a lot of moonlight. But their surprise attack depended on darkness up to the time they arrived over the dropping zones. Thus, their critical demand was for a late rising moon. All right, so we need a late rising moon. The seaborne landings had to take place when the tide was low enough to expose Rommel's beach obstacles. And to complicate the meteorological calculations further, follow-up troops landing much later in the day would also need a low tide. And it had to come before darkness set in. So your window of acceptable conditions is very, very small. These two critical factors of moonlight and tide shackled Eisenhower. Tide alone reduced the number of days for the attack in any 1 month to 6, and 3 of those were moonless. Okay? So the tidal conditions can get you 6 days in the month, but the moon conditions can only get you 3 of those 6 days. And in June, it would be the 5th, 6th, and 7th. A calm sea was required. Apart from the havoc a rough sea might cause to the fleet, seasickness could leave the troops helpless long before they even set foot on the beaches. And of course, many of them did throw up. Nobody at Supreme Headquarters expected perfect conditions on D-Day, least of all Eisenhower. Now it says Supreme Headquarters here because so the theater headquarters was called SHAEF, SHAEF, which was Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Forces. So yeah, so we're looking for, listen, hey, we know conditions are not going to be perfect, but we need the conditions to at least have a minimum acceptability, because if they're not minimally acceptable, then this mission could fail right off the cuff, right? Okay, so of the 3 possible days for the invasion, he had chosen the 5th, so that if there was a postponement, he could launch the assault on the 6th. But if he ordered the landings for the 6th and then had to cancel them again, the problem of refueling and returning convoys might prevent him from attacking on the 7th. All right. So if they don't go within that 5 to 7 window, they're going to have to postpone, and it's just going to get crazy and crazy because they know that the whole operation is going to take months, and they're worried about the winter. So they're already thinking about months ahead in the winter. Now, I said the operation's typically considered to have concluded around the end of August with the liberation of Paris, etc. But what will happen a couple of months later? The Battle of the Bulge. So what is the Battle of the Bulge, which kicks off in December of 1944? It is the German counterattack to try and reverse the Allied gains achieved through Overlord. All right. Shortly before 9:30 that night, Eisenhower's senior commanders and their chiefs of staff gathered in the library of Southwick House. All right, they got the weather guys there briefing them. So they receive a weather brief. All right, so they receive the weather brief. Eisenhower polled his commanders one by one. General Smith thought the attack should go. Now, what are we talking about? We're talking about the 6th, okay? It's already been postponed for the 5th. This is 9:30 p.m. on the night of the 4th. Eisenhower now polled his commanders one by one. General Smith thought the attack should go on the 6th. It was a gamble, but one that should be taken. Tedder and Lee Mallory were both fearful that even the predicted cloud cover would prove too much for the Air Forces to operate effectively. It might mean that the assault would take place without adequate air support. They thought it was going to be chancy. Montgomery, this is Bernard Montgomery, who's going to be the ground forces commander, British Army. Well, he's going to be the ground forces commander for Allied forces. I'm saying he was from the British Army. They thought it was going to be chancy. Montgomery stuck to the decision that he had made the night before when the June 5th D-Day had been postponed. I would say go, he said. It was now up to Ike. The moment had come when only he could make the decision. There was a long silence as Eisenhower weighed all the possibilities. General Smith, watching, was struck by the isolation and loneliness of the Supreme Commander as he sat, hands clasped before him, looking down at the table. The minutes ticked by. Some say 2 minutes passed, others say 5. Then Eisenhower, his face strained, looked up and announced his decision. He said, I am quite positive we must give the order. I don't like it, but there it is. I don't see how we can do anything else. He looked tired, but some of the tension had left his face. 6 hours later, at a brief meeting to review the weather, he would hold to his decision and reconfirm it. Tuesday, June 6th would be D-Day. Eisenhower and his commanders left the room, hurrying now to set the great assault in motion. Behind them, in a silent library, a haze of blue smoke hung over the conference table. The fire reflected itself in the polished floor, and on the mantelpiece, the hands of a clock pointed to 9:45. Okay, so they had this meeting at 9:30. It only lasts a couple of minutes. This is PM on the 4th. The decision is made to go. Eisenhower says, I don't like it. We're going, meaning we're going on the 6th. 6 hours later, very early on the morning of the 5th, the decision is confirmed for the 6th. So when he makes that decision at about 9:30 p.m. on the night of the 4th, and D-Day is going to be on the 6th, it's really just a hair over 24 hours later that it's going to kick off, because D-Day starts, just a couple of minutes after midnight. So you're really talking like 27 hours later. So a lot of things had to get, as soon as he said go on the night of the 4th for the morning of the 6th, you had to set things in motion to be able to actually kick off the operation on the 6th. Okay. So I got just one more thing I want to read here in just a moment, then we'll be done. I know this has been kind of long. I knew this would be a long video. There's a lot to talk about, and we even, and again, we're only scratching the surface, but so, I wanted to maybe share some things with you that you might not necessarily be as familiar with, or maybe you hadn't necessarily heard. What you probably do know is, so when D-Day kicks off, and this is depicted in, in a lot of movies, a lot of people here have probably seen Saving Private Ryan, etc., or other depictions. But they travel south. There are 5 landing sites. So 2 of those will belong to the U.S., and those are Omaha and Utah. British troops will land at landing sites Gold and Sword, and the Canadians will land at Juno. The Canadian site was actually in between the two British sites. So Juno geographically was in between Gold and Sword. So the chain of command, so you've got, I kind of mentioned this before. So the theater commander is Eisenhower. So he is, his title is that he is the Supreme Allied Commander. That's true. His headquarters is SHAEF, which is the Supreme Headquarters for the Allied Expeditionary Forces. He answers to the Combined Chiefs of Staff, which is this combined British and American, committee of their respective chiefs of staff, who each then answer to Churchill and Roosevelt. The ground for what we would today call the ground forces commander, who's actually going to coordinate everything on the ground for for Operation Overlord is going to be Bernard Montgomery, who I mentioned before. But you've also got Omar Nelson Bradley, who is he's a lieutenant general at the time. And you also have a British 3-star general as well, whose name was Miles Dempsey. So there's a lot going on, just a massive, massive, massive operation, of course, as we said. So again, D-Day refers to June 6th, but Operation Overlord is, of course, much larger in scope. It would last until the end of August. It would successfully liberate Western Europe. However, there were a ton of casualties. If you read it all into D-Day, a lot of things went wrong on D-Day. A lot of things went wrong. But in an operation that size with so many variables, it's going to go wrong. And you have to know that going in. But there's also a lot that went right on D-Day, to include the fact that the Germans were largely surprised. They had not expected it. There was a guy in the book, The Longest Day. He's a chief of staff. I think his name was Pimsel, I believe. And he was one of the more senior German officers who said, I think this is the real invasion. I think this is coming, and a lot of the other more senior German officers were more skeptical. So in war, as anybody who's been in the military knows, or if you've ever even just studied it historically, a lot can go wrong, but not everything goes wrong all the time. That's why a lot of times when you train for everything to go wrong, because a lot of times it won't all go wrong in war. It could be really, really bad, but you kind of train for the worst case scenarios and inject as much realism into training as you can, with the added caveat that there's always that psychological component in training that is missing, which is you still know in your head that this isn't real. And so you try to replicate as much as possible tough, realistic training, in as much as you certainly can. The other thing that I just wanted to mention kind of in closing is, so planning and execution. So to be a skilled general or a skilled commander, you have to understand planning as well as execution. They're both important. And your plan doesn't always work out the way you planned, but the process of planning and also understanding contingencies, just having a plan, even if you end up having to deviate from it, having a plan gives you a starting point that everyone at least understands. That is your approach to the problem set. But also having contingencies that units understand and that have been rehearsed and trained on, or I should say trained on and rehearsed. And that means when things go wrong, do you have a plan that has already been developed? Just kind of like an acute plan for that specific instance in which something goes wrong, So in D-Day, many of you are aware that a lot of the guys from these airborne units that jumped. So first of all, a lot of them got injured. A lot of them were miles away from their intended drop zone. So a lot went wrong. People ended up joining other units because they would find people from other units because they'd been either blown off course or because of the German flak that was impacting the ability of the pilots to get to the correct drop zones. Guys were miles from their drop zones or miles from, or separated from their units. They would join another unit. Those things were happening a lot in the early days of the operation. The other thing is that I'll say, and then I'm going to read this and then we'll close out, is understanding what it means to be terrain-based as opposed to enemy-based. So what is your objective? Is your objective to seize terrain, or is your objective to defeat a certain enemy unit? Because those are two distinct objectives that, though related, aren't the same thing. They aren't the same thing at all. To seize terrain, do you generally have to defeat enemy forces? Yes, though not always. And in order to defeat enemy forces, are you going to have to outmaneuver them on the given terrain? And will you find yourself having to seize certain key terrain in order to defeat the enemy unit. Yes, but what is your overall end objective? If it is to seize terrain, and you can seize terrain while engaging with 0 enemy units, then your mission has been a success. And of course, there are many operations in which you don't necessarily want to engage enemy units. If you're one of these pathfinders in the middle of the night and you're supposed to mark a drop zone for the follow-on airborne units that are coming in, doesn't matter whether or not you kill any Germans. You are there for one mission and one mission only. And you can kill 100 German soldiers and still fail in your mission, you know, which could be catastrophic. So yeah, understanding your mission, understanding what it is that you're there to do. Is your mission terrain based or is it enemy based? If you expend a bunch of resources seizing terrain that is unnecessary or not valuable for any follow-on missions, then you just wasted a bunch of lives, resources, to include time, seizing terrain that is not necessarily valuable. So yeah, understanding your mission, understanding what it is you're trying to do, and that sometimes that means prioritizing what it is you want to achieve. All right, so I'm reading here. Last thing I'm going to read, Decision in Normandy, Carlos D'Este, more historical approach than the other books. Kind of a dense book, but a really, really, really good book. So this is an introduction to the 50th anniversary edition, right? The great Allied invasion of Normandy on 6 June 1944 was the most complex and daring military operation in the history of modern warfare. The culmination of more than 3 years of conception, often contentious debate, and the most prodigious military planning ever undertaken. Although a great many military minds were responsible for the detailed planning of Operation Overlord, the conception and execution of the post-D-Day plan of campaign was the brainchild of the Allied Group Commander-in-Chief, General, later Field Marshal, Sir Bernard Law Montgomery. As Eisenhower's designated ground force commander, it fell to him to originate and carry out the Allied battle strategy. Skipping here. The year 1994 marks the 50th year since the D-Day landings, and in that half century, many wars have come and gone, following one of the most momentous days in history. As the years pass, those who fought in Normandy as young men are growing fewer. Later generations will only know of it from the pages of history. It is my sincere wish that this account will serve to shed entirely new light on what historian Max Hastings has aptly called the decisive Western battle of the Second World War. This is the story of one of the last great land battles ever fought, and what occurred during the 80-day campaign, which began on 6 June 1944 and ended in the greatest defeat suffered by Hitler's armies in the West. Okay. So I know I was rambling there, probably moving back and forth, and I was, scrambling to set up and share the screen for some of the stuff that I wanted to show you guys. But there's a lot to cover here. There's a lot that obviously we didn't cover. You'll also notice that I didn't share any graphics. So why did I not share any graphics? I was looking for some graphics to share. I would have at least, I wanted to at least share the landing sites. A lot of you have probably seen those, and there were some good ones, but I couldn't really find one that I liked that I could also verify the source for, and also that was clearly in the public domain. So finding one that was clearly in the public domain that that I could verify the source for proved to be difficult. But if in your mind you can't visualize anything with kind of where the beaches were, where was Omaha in relation to Utah, or where was Juneau in relation to Golden Sword, if you just do like an images search for the Normandy landings, you'll see some pretty good images that will come up. And they may be accurate. I'm just not going to share something with you guys that I can't verify the source for, because then how do I point it to you? You point you to it. But what I will do is I will share with you guys the link to the Substack that I wrote 2 years ago that I started to read from. You can go read the whole thing if you want, and read where I start to question some of the historical narrative, some of the stuff that happens after World War II that the U.S. government was involved in. And then I will also share with you the online book the cross-channel attack that had the digests in the back of it that we looked at. There's one in there that we didn't look at, but it's pretty cool. The one that I showed you was Appendix A, the Cossack Digest. The appendix after that, Appendix B, is the initial directive that Eisenhower received. So that's pretty cool. For a cross-channel invasion, you can read through that. If I thought about it, I would have read through it. I meant to, and then I kind of forgot. Maybe I'll just read it real quick. Should I do that? Yeah, we're here. I'll just pull it up. I'll just at least show it to you guys. Yeah. So this is in the book. I'll show you the link. This is the Cross Channel Attack book. It's online. It's from the U.S. Army's Center of Military History. But I'll just show you this Appendix B. So Appendix A was that Cossack Digest. I showed you two forms. I showed you the one that was all marked up, and the clean version is in this book. But right after that is Appendix B. So this is the directive to Supreme Commander, Allied Expeditionary Force. We'll just look at this real quick. You are hereby designated as Supreme Allied Commander of the forces placed under your orders for operations for liberation of Europe from Germans. Your title will be Supreme Commander, Allied Expeditionary Force. This is to Eisenhower. You, as in you, Eisenhower, will enter the continent of Europe and in conjunction with the other United Nations, undertake operations aimed at the heart of Germany and the destruction of her armed forces. So this is to Eisenhower saying, hey, this is what your headquarters is being tasked with doing. You know, this is what you're going to command. This is what we need you to plan and execute. Command, you are responsible to the combined chiefs of staff and will exercise command generally in accordance with the diagram and appendix. Direct communication with the United States and British chiefs of staff is authorized. Okay, so pretty interesting. Responsibility will rest with the combined chiefs of staff for supplying information relating to operations of the forces of the USSR for your guidance in timing your operations. It is understood that the Soviet forces will launch an offensive at about the same time as Overlord, with the object of preventing the German forces from transferring from the eastern to the western front. The Allied Commander-in-Chief Mediterranean Theater will conduct operations designed to assist your operation, including the launching of an attack against the south of France at about the same time as Overlord. The scope and timing of his operations will be decided by the combined chiefs of staff. You will establish contact with him and submit to the combined chiefs of staff your views and recommendations regarding operations from the Mediterranean in support of your attack from the United Kingdom. Okay. All right. So what is this saying? So, you know, this is a directive to Eisenhower saying, hey, congratulations. You're the Supreme Allied Commander for SHAPE, the Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Forces, Western Europe. So this is your mission we're giving you. You know, you got to liberate Western Europe. Here are some other things that are going to happen in the Mediterranean theater. Okay, not your theater, the adjacent theaters. You can help coordinate with them. You may even have some ideas as to how they might be able to perform operations that will draw German resources away from Western Europe to then further enable Operation Overlord. Okay, that's kind of the way that they're talking about what the Soviets are going to do or what's going to happen in the Mediterranean, et cetera. Okay, all right. So I think we're good here. I know I was kind of all over the place, rambling. Hopefully you got something out of this. If nothing else, D-Day. There are a lot of very brave people who were very, very young who engaged in something that is almost incomprehensible in terms of the audacity, the danger, the psychological challenges that would have been present in having to do what they did those days. and they still did it, not just on D-Day, but in the subsequent months. And I think that that is something to be celebrated and to be honored. You know, celebrate their successes, honor their sacrifices, um, while we can certainly appreciate their courage and commemorate what exactly was achieved at great cost for sure. So I appreciate you hanging in there today, and like and share.